He simply decided to fix the roof of his house and didn't expect anything unusual. But beneath it, he found something that had been hidden for decades. And one call to 911 changed the fate of the entire neighborhood. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The house had never appeared in his life as a dream. It entered it the way compromises always did, quietly, without ceremony, slipping into the narrow space between what he wanted and what he could afford. For most of his adult life, he had lived with the understanding that permanence was something other people earned. He moved often, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by design, though the difference between the two blurred over time. Apartments came and went, each one leaving behind nothing but a forwarding address and a faint sense of relief at having escaped another temporary arrangement before it collapsed under rising rent, a sudden sale, or a notice taped to a door that spoke politely while demanding departure. Every place he had lived carried the same invisible rule. He was allowed to exist there only so long as he remained convenient. Stability was conditional, revocable, never fully his. Over the years, this had shaped the way he thought about space. Homes were not sanctuaries. They were shelters with expiration dates. He learned to keep boxes instead of furniture, to choose objects that could be carried by one person, to avoid attachments that required permanence. The walls he slept behind were never truly his concern, because sooner or later someone else would decide they were no longer his responsibility. Owning a house had once seemed like a distant, almost naive ambition, not because he lacked the discipline or desire, but because the path toward ownership appeared lined with obstacles that accumulated quietly, compounding into something overwhelming. Credit checks that felt like interrogations, down payments that demanded years of sacrifice with no guarantee of success, neighborhoods that seemed welcoming on paper but carried unspoken boundaries once you crossed into them in person. Over time, the idea of a house shifted in his mind from aspiration to abstraction, something theoretically possible but practically unreachable. That began to change not because his circumstances improved dramatically, but because exhaustion set in. He grew tired of living inside other people's margins, tired of waking up knowing that the place he slept in could be taken away with 30 days' notice, tired of measuring his life in leases rather than years. When he finally sat down and ran the numbers, not with hope but with cold precision, the conclusion surprised him. The money he had been pouring into rent, into a cycle that returned nothing but temporary safety, could instead be redirected into something broken but permanent. Something flawed, but his. The listings he scrolled through reflected that mindset. He did not linger on houses with manicured lawns and bright kitchens. Those belonged to another version of life, one that required optimism he no longer trusted. He searched instead for words like as is, needs work, price to sell, houses with warnings embedded in their descriptions, places that required tolerance for imperfection and an acceptance of risk. When he saw the listing for the house at the edge of town, he recognized it immediately for what it was. Cheap enough to be suspicious. Old enough to carry history in its walls. Photographed carefully, with angles chosen to soften the damage and emphasize what remained intact. The house did not invite admiration. It asked to be considered. He visited it on a quiet afternoon, driving past familiar streets that gradually gave way to something less certain. The town center, with its brick storefronts and restrained order, receded behind him. In its place came blocks where maintenance was uneven and time showed openly. Some houses stood proudly, freshly painted and cared for. Others sagged into themselves, held upright by habit rather than intention. His future home sat somewhere between those extremes, neither abandoned nor loved, existing in a state of prolonged endurance. From the outside, the house appeared almost modest. Its narrow structure rose beneath a pitched roof that gave it a faint sense of dignity despite its age. The siding was weathered but whole. The windows were small, their frames worn smooth by decades of exposure. Nothing about it stood out sharply, which may have been its greatest asset. It blended into the street the way things did when they had been there long enough to become invisible. A place people passed without really seeing. The street itself felt watchful, not hostile but cautious. Curtains shifted subtly as he stepped out of his car. A man farther down the block paused in his yard, glancing up briefly before returning to his work. There were nods, but no greetings, the kind of acknowledgement that acknowledged presence without welcoming it. He recognized the pattern. He had lived long enough in places like this to understand the language of distance. Familiarity was not granted quickly here. It was earned through repetition, through time spent not causing trouble. Inside, the house revealed its age without apology. The floors dipped gently in places, worn thin by years of footsteps. The walls bore faint cracks that traced the building's slow settling, lines like quiet confessions of strain. The air carried a layered smell of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic that he could not immediately place. It was not unpleasant, but it was persistent, clinging to the space like a memory that refused to fade. He walked through the room slowly, not imagining furniture or decoration, but listening. Old houses spoke if you paid attention. They creaked and shifted, responding to weight and temperature, revealing which parts had grown tired and which still held firm. This one felt guarded, not in a way that suggested danger, but in a way that implied restraint, as if it had learned over time to keep its history close. The attic access caught his attention more than anything else. A narrow hatch in the ceiling, slightly off-center, its edges worn smooth by hands that had opened it many times in the past. He stood beneath it longer than he intended, feeling a vague tension he could not explain. There was nothing overtly wrong with it. No stains, no visible damage. Yet the presence of the hatch lingered in his awareness, like a thought that refused to settle. He dismissed the feeling as nerves. Buying a house, especially one like this, came with a flood of doubts that manifested in strange ways. He focused instead on practicalities. The inspector's report had been thorough and unsparing. Electrical issues that would need attention. Plumbing that showed its age. Foundation settling that was not immediately dangerous but would require monitoring. And the roof. The roof was described not in years, but in eras. Its age was measured less by when it had been installed and more by how many times it had been patched. The inspector had been blunt about that. The roof would need work. Perhaps not immediately, but soon. Water had a way of finding weaknesses, and this roof had many. He had nodded, accepting the assessment without argument. He was not buying perfection. He was buying endurance. When he signed the papers, there was no surge of pride or triumph, only a steady, grounding sensation like placing weight onto something solid after a long imbalance. The house was his now. Broken, tired, imperfect, but no longer subject to someone else's decision. For the first time in years, the address attached to his name did not feel temporary. The first weeks passed quietly. He unpacked slowly, arranging his life in a way that acknowledged the space rather than tried to reshape it immediately. He learned how the light moved through the rooms at different times of day. He learned which floorboards protested and which accepted his weight silently. He noticed how the house reacted to temperature changes, how the walls held cold longer than he expected, how the air shifted at night. Neighbors continued to observe from a distance. There were no invitations, no sudden warmth, but there was also no hostility, just a quiet assessment, a measuring of his presence against the unspoken standards of the street. He did not mind. He had learned long ago that some places needed time to adjust to new occupants, especially ones who did not fit neatly into established patterns. As days turned into weeks, he began to feel a cautious sense of ownership take root. Not pride, exactly, but responsibility. When something creaked, it was his concern. When a faucet dripped, it was his problem to solve. The house demanded attention, and in that demand, it offered something he had not experienced in a long time. Agency? Still, there were moments when unease crept in. Late at night, when the house settled into itself, sounds traveled differently. The attic, in particular, seemed to hold the day's heat longer than expected, radiating it downward in a way that felt disproportionate to its size. He found himself thinking about it, without intending to, about the space above the ceiling and what it had witnessed over the years. He told himself this was nothing more than imagination, a side effect of living alone in an unfamiliar place. He had no reason to believe otherwise. At this stage, the house was simply old. It had weathered decades of use, neglect, and repair. Whatever history it carried was abstract, distant, safely contained within the past. He could not yet know that this assumption rested on a fragile surface, much like the roof itself. That beneath the layers of patchwork and age, something deliberate waited, something patient. For now, the house remained what he believed it to be, a compromise, a calculation, a shelter earned through persistence rather than fortune. And as he went about the quiet work of settling in, unaware of how thin the barrier between past and present truly was, the roof above him held its secrets, pressed carefully into place, waiting for the moment when water and necessity would force them into the open. The rain arrived without warning, not as a sudden violence, but as a quiet persistence that settled over the house and refused to leave. At first it was gentle, almost comforting, the soft tapping against the windows blending with the muted sounds of the neighborhood settling in for the night. He noticed it only distantly, registering the rhythm the way one registers background noise, something that exists without demanding attention. The house absorbed those early drops without complaint, its walls and roof responding as they had countless times before. As the evening deepened, the rain grew heavier. The sound changed subtly, shifting from a light patter to a more deliberate drumming. It pressed against the roof with a weight that felt intentional, as if the sky had decided to empty itself directly onto this one narrow structure. He lay awake longer than usual, listening. Old houses always sounded different during storms. They groaned and expanded, reacted to pressure and moisture in ways newer buildings had forgotten how to express. He told himself that this was normal, that nothing about the sound above him suggested danger. The first drop fell sometime after midnight. It struck the floor near the living room window with a soft, hollow sound that cut through the steady noise of rain. He sat up immediately, the way people do when something interrupts sleep too cleanly to be dismissed as imagination. He waited, listening, hoping it was a fluke, perhaps condensation, perhaps something knocked loose by the wind. But then came another drop, followed by another, each landing in a slightly different place, each confirming what he already suspected but did not want to accept. He moved through the house with a quiet urgency, switching on lamps, scanning the ceilings for dark spots. The stains were faint at first, barely visible, but once he noticed them, they seemed to spread under his gaze. Thin lines of moisture traced their way along seams he had never paid attention to before, revealing paths of weakness that had existed long before he arrived. Buckets and bowls emerged from cabinets, placed carefully beneath the slow drip of water. The sound of it landing echoed too loudly in the quiet rooms, a steady reminder that the barrier between inside and outside had failed. By morning, the rain had eased, but the damage remained. The air inside the house felt heavier, tinged with the unmistakable smell of damp wood. The stains on the ceiling had darkened, settling into shapes that would not fade easily. He stood beneath them, looking up, feeling a mix of frustration and resignation. This was not cosmetic. This was not something that could be ignored or postponed. The roof, already flagged as a weakness, had finally asserted itself. He made calls that morning, though he already knew how they would go. Contractors spoke politely, professionally, their voices carrying the practiced tone of people accustomed to delivering bad news. Estimates were given that might as well have belonged to another world. The numbers did not align with his reality, no matter how he rearranged them. Each call ended the same way, with a vague promise to consider options and a growing certainty that hiring help was not possible. Standing alone in the kitchen afterward, he felt the familiar pressure of necessity closing in. There were problems that could be lived with, tolerated, adapted around. This was not one of them. Water did not negotiate. It found its way through patience and persistence, exploiting every weakness until something gave. If another storm like this came, the damage would deepen, spreading beyond ceilings into beams and walls, into the bones of the house itself. The decision to climb onto the roof formed slowly, not as an act of confidence but of inevitability. He had never been comfortable with heights. Years earlier, a fall had left him with a lingering respect for gravity, a quiet awareness of how quickly balance could turn into disaster. Since then, he avoided ladders whenever possible, deferred tasks that required leaving the ground. But avoidance did not stop water from entering his home. Fear did not pay for repairs. He approached the task methodically, almost ceremonially, as though thoroughness might protect him from what he could not control. He inspected the ladder twice, pressing his weight against it to test its stability. He gathered tools with deliberate care, laying them out and checking each one, making sure nothing was missing. He charged his phone fully and slipped it into his pocket, telling himself it was for emergencies, though the word felt vague and insufficient. Before climbing, he stood in the yard and looked up at the roof. From below, it appeared unchanged, its surface smooth in the morning light, the damage hidden beneath layers of material and time. It gave nothing away. The house looked calm, composed, as if the storm had never touched it. That calm felt deceptive, but he could not articulate why. As he set the ladder against the side of the house, he became aware of movement along the street. Neighbors passed at a distance, some slowing briefly, others pretending not to notice. A man across the way paused on his porch, his gaze lingering for a moment before drifting elsewhere. The attention was subtle, but it registered. Working on your own roof marked you as something specific. Unprepared, perhaps. Desperate, maybe. He did not look back. He focused instead on the ladder, on the solid feel of the rungs beneath his hands. Each step upward tightened his chest. He kept his eyes forward, not allowing himself to look down. By the time he reached the roof line, his palms were slick with sweat despite the cool air. He pulled himself up carefully, settling onto the shingles and pausing to let his body adjust. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted up faintly, distorted by height and distance. Cars passing. A dog barking somewhere beyond a fence. Ordinary noises that felt strangely far away. Up close, the roof told a different story than it had from the ground. Materials overlapped in ways that made little structural sense. Repairs had been layered rather than replaced, each one concealing damage rather than resolving it. Some sections felt solid beneath his weight, reassuring in their resistance. Others responded differently, giving slightly, producing a hollow sensation that sent a flicker of unease through him. He moved slowly, testing each shift of weight before committing to it. The smell of the roof rose around him, warmed by the sun. Old tar, aged wood, dampness lingering where water had been trapped. He followed the areas above the rooms where leaks had appeared, expecting to find obvious failures. Cracked shingles, lifted edges, nails pushed up like exposed bones. And he did find some of these, just as the inspector had warned. Signs of age, of fatigue. But there were other details that did not fit as neatly. Certain patches of shingles were newer than the surrounding material, but the transitions were too careful, too precise. Nails differed not just in age, but in type. Their spacing was deliberate, inconsistent with hurried repairs. In places, the underlayers felt doubled, not for strength, but to obscure something beneath. The pattern of the leaks unsettled him most. Water followed paths of least resistance, but here the paths seemed guided, almost intentional. The stains inside the house had spread outward in shapes that suggested seams rather than random failure. He traced those imagined seams upward, his attention narrowing, his focus sharpening. As the sun climbed higher, the roof warmed, easing some of his physical tension but sharpening his awareness. He found himself listening to the house, not for sound, but for resistance, for the way the structure responded beneath him. It was subtle, but it was there. An impression that certain areas had been altered and then deliberately ignored. He reminded himself to stay grounded. Old houses were full of quirks. Repairs made by previous owners varied in quality and logic. Not every irregularity carried meaning. Fatigue and height could amplify suspicion, turning ordinary imperfections into imagined threats. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to focus on the task he had come to do. Still, a sense of anticipation settled over him, quiet but persistent. The roof no longer felt like a simple surface. It felt layered with decisions, with choices made long before he arrived. And, as he continued his careful inspection, inching closer to the center ridge where the structure subtly changed, he could not shake the feeling that this repair would demand more than nails and patches. That whatever waited beneath the worn shingles had already begun to surface, carried upward by water and necessity, pressing gently but insistently against the thin barrier that separated the present from something far older and far less willing to remain hidden. He remained seated on the roof longer than he intended, letting his breathing settle before moving again. From this height, the street below looked flattened, compressed into a narrow strip of muted color and slow movement. The distance distorted sound as well. What reached him was no longer distinct but softened, as if filtered through layers of air and time. The separation made the roof feel like a world of its own, suspended above ordinary life, governed by different rules. When he finally began to move again, he did so carefully, almost reverently. Each shift of weight was measured, each hand placement deliberate. He was not simply inspecting shingles anymore. He was reading the surface, interpreting the subtle language of resistance and give beneath his palms and knees. The roof responded unevenly, and the more attention he paid, the clearer that unevenness became. Some sections behaved as expected. They were firm, predictable, the layered materials beneath the shingles providing a reassuring solidity. Other sections responded differently, yielding just enough to register as wrong without collapsing into obvious failure. It was not the soft rot of water-damaged wood. It was something else, something hollowed, altered, as though space had been introduced where it did not belong. He crawled slowly toward the area above the living room where the first drops had appeared during the storm. The ceiling beneath that section still bore the stain, darkened now into a permanent mark. He tried to align what he remembered seeing inside with what lay beneath him now, mapping the interior to the exterior in his mind. Old houses often required that kind of mental overlay, an understanding of how rooms translated into structure. But here the translation felt imprecise, as if the roof did not fully correspond to the space below. As he shifted closer to the center ridge, the differences grew more pronounced. The shingles here were arranged with a precision that stood out against the surrounding wear. Their edges aligned too neatly. The overlaps were consistent in a way that did not match the rest of the roof's patched history. It looked less like a repair and more like an insertion, a section placed carefully within an older framework. He pressed his palm flat against the surface and applied gentle pressure. The area resisted firmly, then responded with a muted hollowness beneath, a sensation that traveled up his arm. He withdrew his hand and tried again, slower this time, focusing on the feedback. The sensation was unmistakable. There was space beneath this section that should not have been there. He paused, sitting back on his heels, and scanned the surrounding area. The roof line from this vantage point appeared uniform. Nothing bulged outward, nothing sagged. From the street below, no one would ever notice this subtle irregularity. It was the kind of detail that revealed itself only under close scrutiny, only to someone who had a reason to be there. He reminded himself again not to invent meaning where none existed. Repairs over decades could produce strange results. Previous owners might have reinforced certain areas, replaced boards, added layers to compensate for weakness. Yet, the more he examined the section, the less convincing that explanation felt. The materials here were not simply newer, they were different. The nails held them in place were spaced evenly, not hurriedly. The wood beneath the shingles felt treated, chosen, rather than scavenged or improvised. A faint line caught his eye as the sun shifted. It ran perpendicular to the direction of the shingles, barely visible unless the light struck it at just the right angle. He leaned closer, squinting. The line was too straight to be a crack, too deliberate to be a split caused by weather. It looked like a seam. The word settled into his mind with a quiet weight. A seam implied joining, separation. Two things brought together intentionally. His throat tightened slightly as he traced the line with his finger. The material here met itself in a way that suggested access rather than damage, a boundary that could be crossed. For a moment, he considered stopping. The task he had set out to do did not require this level of investigation. He could patch visible damage, replace cracked shingles, seal obvious entry points for water. He could leave this area untouched, convince himself that the roof's age accounted for its oddities. But the thought rang hollow. The seam existed whether he acknowledged it or not, and now that he had seen it, it was impossible to unsee. He reached for the flat bar he had brought with him, its worn metal familiar in his grip. He slid it carefully beneath the edge of a shingle near the seam, testing gently. There was resistance at first, the expected stubbornness of aged material. Then, unexpectedly, it gave way. The shingle lifted too easily, separating with a dry sound that suggested adhesive rather than decay. That ease unsettled him more than anything else. Old shingles clung. They cracked, tore, resisted removal. This one behaved as though it had been placed with the expectation that it might one day be lifted again. He raised it further and found another layer beneath, not the usual underlayment, but a plank laid crosswise to the rest of the structure. The wood was darker than the surrounding boards, its grain tight and deliberate. It was not new, but it was not as old as the rest of the roof either. Nails held it in place, but they were driven in a way that suggested temporary fastening rather than permanence. They could be removed without damaging the board. He recognized that detail immediately, and the recognition sent a quiet chill through him. He lifted another shingle, then another, widening the opening just enough to see more clearly. Beneath the plank, darkness waited. Not the shallow shadow of insulation or attic space, but a deeper void, compact and enclosed. The air rising from it felt cooler against his skin, carrying a stale scent of enclosed wood and dust that had not been disturbed in a long time. He hesitated, his heart beating louder in his ears. The roof no longer felt like part of the house's exterior. It felt like a lid. He turned on his phone's flashlight and angled it downward into the opening. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust suspended in the air like fine ash. Webs stretched thickly between beams, undisturbed. And then, at the far edge of the light, shapes emerged that did not belong to the structure itself. At first, his mind resisted interpreting them. He tried to see boards, insulation bundles, forgotten debris, but the shapes did not resolve into anything so mundane. They were too regular, too aligned. As he adjusted the angle of the light, the outline of a wooden edge appeared, followed by another. Rectangular, solid, boxes. They were arranged carefully within the cavity, tucked between beams as if the space had been measured in advance. There was no chaos here, no random accumulation. Everything had a place. Dust coated their surfaces thickly, indicating years, perhaps decades, without disturbance. Yet their placement spoke of intention rather than abandonment. He sat back abruptly, his balance momentarily forgotten, his weight shifting in a way that reminded him sharply of where he was. He steadied himself, breathing shallowly. The roof, the street below, the quiet movement of the day all felt distant now. There was only the opening and what lay beneath it. A part of him wanted to cover it immediately, to press the plank back into place, slide the shingles down, and seal the seam as though it had never been touched. He imagined climbing down, finishing the repair elsewhere, convincing himself that whatever lay beneath was none of his concern. Old houses hid things. That was simply part of their nature. But the knowledge had already lodged itself in him. Those boxes existed above his ceiling, inside his house, concealed deliberately. And if they were heavy enough to require this kind of construction, they were not trivial. Whatever they contained had been important enough for someone to hide it carefully and leave it behind. He leaned forward again, drawn by a mix of caution and necessity. He widened the opening slightly, enough to see more of the cavity. It extended along the roof line, a narrow corridor between beams, not large enough for a person to move through comfortably, but sufficient to store several bulky items. He counted them quickly as his light passed over their shapes. 1, 2, 3, more than 3, at least 5. The number alone unsettled him. One box might have been dismissed as a forgotten cache. 5 suggested planning. He reached into the cavity, his fingers brushing against the rough surface of the nearest box. The wood felt dry, solid, aged. He pulled his hand back instinctively, not from pain, but from the shock of contact. This was real, not imagined, not symbolic. A hidden storage space built into the roof of his house, filled with objects deliberately placed and left behind. He considered the practical implications. The roof was compromised now. Leaving the cavity exposed was not an option. Another rain would pour directly into the space, potentially damaging whatever lay inside and causing further structural issues. Even if the boxes were empty, even if they contained nothing but worthless debris, they would have to be dealt with. Ignoring them would only deepen the problem. He also understood that this was not something to handle casually while perched on a roof. If the boxes were heavier than expected, shifting them here could throw him off balance. If they contained sharp objects or hazardous materials, he could injure himself. The sensible approach was to move them to a safer, more controlled space. His gaze drifted towards the small attic window not far from the opening. The alignment struck him then. The cavity's position relative to the attic access was too convenient. Someone could have moved items in and out of this space without ever being seen from outside, using the attic as an intermediary. The realization deepened his unease. This had not been an afterthought. It had been designed. He worked carefully, methodically. One by one, he maneuvered the boxes toward the opening, testing their weight before committing to pulling them free. They were heavier than he expected, dense with unknown contents. Each movement required patience, a careful negotiation between gravity and caution. When he finally eased the first box out onto the roof beside him, he felt the strain in his arms and shoulders immediately. The box was old, its edges worn smooth by time rather than use. Dust clung to it thickly. There were no labels, no markings to indicate its contents, just plain wood, assembled with care. He set it down gently and reached for the next one, repeating the process until all of them lay beside him in a quiet row. From the street below, anyone looking up would have seen nothing unusual. A man working on his roof, a few pieces of debris, nothing that suggested what had just been uncovered. Still, he was acutely aware of being visible. He glanced down and caught movement at the edge of his vision. A neighbor had stepped onto a porch. Another paused near a driveway. He could not tell if they were watching him specifically or simply noticing the activity, but the awareness made his movements more deliberate. He needed to get the boxes inside without drawing attention. He secured a rope around the first box, tying it carefully, testing the knot with a firm pull. Then he guided it toward the attic window and began to lower it, controlling its descent inch by inch. The rope burned slightly against his palms as the weight shifted, but he kept it steady, careful not to let it swing. One by one, he lowered the boxes into the attic, his arms trembling with effort by the time he reached the last. When it finally settled below, he sat back, chest heaving, and looked at the opening in the roof. The cavity now stood empty, a dark recess between beams, bearing the faint outlines where the boxes had rested for so long. He slid the planks back into place temporarily and laid the shingles over the seam as best he could. It was not a proper repair, only a cover, a temporary closure of something he could no longer pretend did not exist. He would return to fix it properly later. For now, his attention had shifted entirely. As he climbed down the ladder, his movements were less careful than before, urgency replacing caution. When his feet finally touched the ground, he stood still for a moment, letting the solidity of it steady him. The house loomed above, unchanged in appearance, but irrevocably altered in meaning. Whatever the boxes contained, they were no longer hidden. They had crossed a boundary, moving from the sealed space beneath the roof into the present, into his awareness. And as he made his way inside toward the attic, the sense that the house had been holding something back for years solidified into certainty. The roof had not merely leaked, it had revealed. The attic greeted him with the same stale warmth it always had, but now that warmth felt heavier, altered by the presence of the boxes resting on the floorboards. Dust rose in soft clouds as he stepped inside, catching the light from his flashlight and drifting slowly back down, as though the space itself were unsettled by what had been brought into it. The boards creaked under his weight, responding with tired familiarity, yet something in the atmosphere had shifted. The attic was no longer merely an unused space beneath the roof. It had become a threshold. He stood for a long moment without moving, listening to the house settle around him. The sounds from below felt muted, distant, as if the attic existed slightly outside the normal flow of the house's life. The boxes lay in a rough line where he had lowered them, their wooden surfaces dulled by years of dust. They looked ordinary at first glance, unremarkable in size and construction, but the care with which they had been hidden gave them a gravity that ordinary objects did not possess. He approached the first box slowly, crouching beside it. The wood was dry beneath his fingers, its grain worn smooth by time rather than use. There were no markings on the lid, no names, no dates, no indication of ownership. Whoever had placed it here had not intended for it to be identified easily. He paused, aware of the moment's weight. Until now, the discovery had been structural, architectural. He had found a space and objects within it, but their meaning remained abstract. Opening the box would change that. It would transform suspicion into knowledge. He lifted the lid carefully. It resisted at first, then came free with a soft, dusty sound. Inside, the contents were wrapped tightly in layers of aged plastic and fabric, bundled with a care that immediately distinguished them from forgotten junk. He peeled back the outer layer slowly, his movements deliberate, as though rushing might damage something fragile, not just physically, but emotionally. The first thing he saw was the corner of a photograph. He drew the bundle out and laid it flat on the floorboards, unwrapping it layer by layer until the contents were fully exposed. Dozens of photographs lay stacked together, their edges slightly curled, their surfaces dulled but intact. He picked up the top one and held it closer to the light. The image showed the house, not a vague resemblance or a similar structure, but this exact house, captured from an angle he recognized instantly. The front yard, the same narrow driveway, the same uneven line of shrubs along the fence. The photograph was old, the colors faded into muted tones, but the details were unmistakable. This was not a coincidence. Someone had stood where he stood now, decades earlier, and pointed a camera at this place. He moved through the stack slowly, one photograph at a time. The house appeared again and again, in different seasons, under different skies. Sometimes it stood alone. Other times, figures appeared near it, always positioned carefully, never casually. The same man appeared in many of the images, though never quite the same way twice. In some, he stood at the edge of the frame, partially turned away. In others, he was closer, his face visible, but his expression guarded, watchful. He was not smiling in any of them. The repetition unsettled him. This was not documentation in the way families documented their lives. These photographs did not celebrate moments or preserve joy. They recorded presence. They asserted existence. The house was not a backdrop. It was the subject. In the background of some images, other people appeared, but rarely clearly. They stood with their backs turned or their faces obscured by shadow, hats, or distance. It was as though the photographer had been careful not to capture them fully, or as though they themselves had avoided the lens. The effect was eerie, a collection of half-seen lives orbiting a fixed point. He set the photographs aside and opened the second box. Inside were several thick albums, their covers worn, their bindings loose with age. He lifted one carefully and opened it. The pages inside were heavy, yellowed, the plastic sleeves clouded but intact. Photographs filled them from edge to edge. At first glance, the albums appeared conventional. Family groupings, posed arrangements, but as he turned the pages, the absence of something became apparent. There were no captions, no names, no dates written in careful script beneath smiling faces. The images existed without context, suspended in anonymity. The people in the photographs rarely touched one another. They stood close, but not connected. There were no arms draped casually over shoulders, no gestures of affection captured mid-movement. Even children, when they appeared, looked stiff, their expressions restrained. The sense of warmth typically associated with family albums was conspicuously absent. As the pages progressed, the number of people began to dwindle. Early sections showed larger groupings. Later ones featured fewer figures. Faces disappeared without explanation, replaced by empty spaces on the pages where photographs might have been, but were not. Toward the end of the album, several pages remained completely blank, the plastic sleeves yellowed but empty, as though the story they were meant to hold had ended prematurely. He closed the album slowly and reached for another. The pattern repeated. Different faces, different settings, but the same absence of intimacy. The same careful distance. The same slow thinning of presence over time. These were not albums meant to be shared proudly. They were records, assembled with intention, documenting continuity rather than connection. As he examined the images, a realization began to take shape. These photographs were not meant to preserve memory in the way families typically preserved it. They were meant to establish something else. Proof. Of what, he could not yet say, but the compulsion behind their creation was clear. Someone had been documenting their existence meticulously, as though anticipating erasure. He thought again of the man who appeared repeatedly in the photographs, always near the house, always watchful. The former owner, or at least one of them. The house had not simply been a residence. It had been an anchor, a fixed point around which these images revolved. The attic seemed quieter now, the silence pressing in more tightly. He became acutely aware of the fact that he was a black man alone in a small-town attic, holding the carefully preserved visual record of someone else's life, someone whose choices had shaped the space he now occupied. The weight of that reality settled over him slowly, bringing with it a tension he could not dismiss as mere unease. He returned the albums to the floor beside the photographs and sat back, his flashlight resting against a beam, its light illuminating the spread of images. The house below him creaked softly, responding to changes in temperature and weight. Ordinary sounds, yet they felt altered now, as though the structure itself were aware of the attention focused on its past. He tried to place the images within a timeline. The clothing styles shifted subtly across the albums, indicating decades rather than years. The house aged within the photographs as well, its siding changing, repairs appearing and disappearing. Yet, through all of it, the same sense of control remained. These were not candid snapshots. They were composed, intentional, almost defensive. The realization that settled most heavily on him was not fear, but clarity. The boxes were not hidden to protect sentimental items from decay. They had been hidden to preserve a narrative. Someone had wanted these records to survive even if they themselves did not. The house had served as a vault, not for valuables, but for evidence of a life lived deliberately apart from scrutiny. He packed the photographs and albums back into the box carefully, restoring the layers of wrapping as best he could. Though he was tempted to continue opening the other boxes immediately, he forced himself to pause. The images alone had already altered his understanding of the house. Whatever else lay waiting would not exist in isolation. It would connect to what he had already seen, deepen it, complicate it. As he stood and looked around the attic once more, the space no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited by absence, by the accumulated intention of someone who had lived here before him and left behind not memories, but traces. The photographs and albums had introduced him to that presence without ever revealing its full shape. He understood now that the house had not simply been sold and forgotten. It had been abandoned with purpose, and the story preserved above his ceiling was not finished revealing itself. He did not leave the attic immediately after closing the box of photographs and albums. He remained seated on the floorboards, his back against a beam, letting the weight of what he had seen settle into him. The images had not frightened him outright. They had done something quieter and more destabilizing. They had introduced intention. Someone had lived here with a purpose that extended beyond ordinary life, beyond family or comfort. The house had been used as an anchor, a fixed point around which careful records were built and preserved. That realization made the remaining boxes feel heavier without his having touched them yet. He rose slowly and turned toward the third box. Its lid bore deeper scratches than the others, marks that suggested repeated handling before it was finally sealed away. The wood creaked faintly as he opened it, the sound sharp in the stillness of the attic. Inside, the contents were wrapped more tightly than the photographs had been, layers of cloth and oil-darkened paper folded with meticulous care. The smell that escaped as he loosened the wrapping was distinct. Old paper carried a scent all its own, dry and slightly acidic, tinged with something metallic that lingered at the back of his throat. The first diary lay at the top of the stack. It was smaller than he expected, its cover worn smooth at the edges, the spine cracked from use. He lifted it gently, aware of its fragility. The pages inside were yellowed, some brittle, their margins darkened by time and handling. The handwriting was firm but uneven, slanting sharply in places, tightening in others as though the writer's hand had not always obeyed the same rhythm as their thoughts. He did not read deeply at first. He let his eyes move across the pages, absorbing patterns rather than meaning. Dates appeared sporadically, sometimes precise, sometimes absent altogether. Certain words repeated with unsettling regularity. Waiting, watchful, necessary, mistake, debt. There were references to nights spent awake, to listening, to being seen or almost seen. The voice that emerged from the pages was not reflective or sentimental. It was defensive, alert, written by someone who believed that attention itself carried risk. As he turned further into the diary, the tone shifted subtly. Early entries carried a sense of control, even confidence. The writer described routines, movements, preparations. Over time, that certainty eroded. The language became fractured, sentences trailing off or circling the same idea repeatedly. There were mentions of others, always vaguely described, always referred to in ways that suggested obligation rather than camaraderie. The writer did not name them. Names, it seemed, were dangerous things to commit to paper. He closed the diary and reached for the others beneath it. There were several, each one smaller than the last, as though space had become more precious with time. The progression between them told a story even before he read a word. The handwriting tightened. The margins narrowed. Blank pages grew more frequent toward the ends, not because the diaries were finished, but because the writer had stopped writing. One entry, near the end of the final diary, caught his attention despite his efforts to remain detached. The handwriting there was more deliberate, pressed into the page with unusual force. The language shifted from observation to resolve. There were references to a place away from the house, a location described obliquely through landmarks rather than addresses. A tree with a distinct bend. A field no longer worked. A structure that had once served a purpose and now served none. The entry ended without flourish, without explanation, as though the act of writing itself had been concluded. He set the diaries aside carefully, stacking them in the order he had found them. The picture forming in his mind was not yet complete, but its shape was becoming clearer. These were not the private reflections of an ordinary person. They were records kept by someone who anticipated scrutiny, who understood that their life required documentation not for remembrance, but for justification or warning. He turned then to the fourth box. It was heavier than the others, dense in a way that suggested solid contents rather than paper or cloth. When he lifted the lid, he understood why. Inside lay ammunition, neatly arranged in rows, each piece wrapped in oiled fabric to prevent corrosion. Beneath the ammunition rested firearms, older models but well-maintained. The metal was clean, the mechanisms intact. These were not relics forgotten in a moment of panic. They had been stored with care, prepared for use even if that use never came. He examined them without touching them directly, using the flashlight to inspect details. The weapons showed signs of handling, not excessive, but familiar. Someone had known them well enough to trust them. The presence of the ammunition alongside them removed any doubt about their purpose. This was not a collection assembled out of nostalgia or curiosity. It was functional. The contrast between the diaries and the weapons unsettled him. The writing spoke of fear, of isolation, of an awareness that something was coming. The weapons spoke of preparation, of readiness. Together, they formed a narrative of intent rather than impulse. Whatever the former owner had been anticipating, they had not faced it unarmed. He became acutely aware of his own position then. He was standing in the attic of a house he had purchased cheaply, alone, holding knowledge that did not belong to him, but now could not be unlearned. The weapons had been hidden not simply to avoid discovery, but to remain available if needed. The fact that they had never been retrieved suggested that whatever plan had existed had ended elsewhere. His thoughts returned to the entry describing the place away from the house. The language there had carried a finality absent from the rest of the diaries. It had not read like an escape. It had read like an end. He closed the box carefully, restoring the layers of cloth as best he could. The attic felt different now, less like a storage space and more like a repository of decisions. Each box represented a facet of a single trajectory: documentation, observation, preparation, and, finally, withdrawal. He sat back again, his legs stiff, his mind racing. The house had not been a refuge for this person. It had been a staging ground, a place to organize, to wait, to record. The roof cavity, concealed and deliberate, had preserved the remnants of that life exactly as it had been left, untouched by time except for the slow accumulation of dust. The significance of that struck him with a quiet force. People hid valuables to protect them. They hid weapons to retrieve them later. They hid records only when they believed someone might need to find them. The former owner had not expected to return, but they had expected discovery. He looked around the attic again, noticing details that had seemed inconsequential before. The way the floorboards beneath the boxes were less warped, as if reinforced. The way a section of insulation had been cut and replaced to allow easier access to the roof cavity. The alignment between the attic hatch and the concealed space above it. None of it was accidental. The house had been modified to support secrecy. For the first time since moving in, he felt something like intrusion. Not because he had entered the attic, but because he had stepped into a story that was never meant for him, yet had been left where he could not avoid it. As a black man in a town that already regarded him with quiet caution, the implications of what he held weighed heavily. The weapons alone carried danger beyond their physical presence. The diaries suggested a past shaped by paranoia and preparation. Combined with the photographs, they pointed toward a life lived in opposition to something or someone. He considered, briefly, the possibility of putting everything back exactly as it had been. Repairing the roof properly, sealing the cavity, leaving the boxes untouched. The house would remain stable. His life might return to its careful, newly established rhythm, but the thought did not hold. The knowledge had already shifted something fundamental. Silence would not restore safety. It would only preserve uncertainty. He needed to understand the final piece of the plan. The place described in the diaries. The point toward which everything seemed to move. Without that, the story remained suspended, unresolved. And unresolved stories had a way of pressing on the present until they were addressed. As he prepared to leave the attic, closing the hatch behind him, the house felt heavier than it had before. Not oppressive, but charged, as though it had been waiting for someone to notice the pattern it held. The photographs had shown a life anchored to this place. The diaries had revealed the mind that shaped that life. The weapons had confirmed intention. What remained was consequence. Downstairs, the light through the windows had shifted, marking the passage of time he had barely noticed. He stood in the quiet of the living room, aware that the decision forming in him would carry him beyond the house, beyond the roof and its secrets, into the open landscape hinted at in fading ink and guarded words. The next step would not be taken within these walls. It would lead outward, toward a place where the former owner's careful planning had reached its final expression, and where the meaning of everything hidden above his ceiling would at last be revealed. He did not sleep that night. The house, which had slowly begun to feel familiar in the weeks since he moved in, now seemed alert, as though its quiet had sharpened into attention. Every sound carried farther than before. The settle-in of beams, the faint ticking of pipes cooling after use, even the soft movement of air through the rooms felt amplified. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, fully aware that just above it rested an emptiness where something deliberate had once been hidden, and that the objects now sitting in the attic had already altered the meaning of the structure around him. The final diary entry returned to him again and again. The words themselves were not dramatic. There were no confessions, no explicit declarations of guilt or fear. Yet their restraint carried a weight that the earlier entries did not. The writer had stopped circling their thoughts. They had moved toward something definite. The references to the place away from the house were precise enough to be followed, but vague enough to conceal their destination from anyone unfamiliar with the landscape. It was not secrecy born of haste. It was secrecy refined through repetition. By morning, the decision had settled into him with quiet inevitability. He could not leave the story unfinished. The house had already yielded too much to allow retreat. Whatever lay at the end of the former owner's careful planning would not fade simply because he chose to ignore it. The knowledge would remain, pressing outward, demanding resolution. Understanding, he realized, was not curiosity at this point. It was necessity. He gathered the diaries and photographs again, laying them out on the dining table where the morning light fell cleanly across their surfaces. With fresh eyes, he began to study them not as artifacts, but as guides. The photographs were particularly revealing when viewed in sequence. Background details that had seemed incidental now took on significance. A line of trees at the edge of a frame. A distant structure barely visible behind a subject's shoulder. A bend in a dirt road that appeared in multiple images, always from the same angle, always partially obscured. He cross-referenced these details with the diary entries, reading more carefully this time. The language describing the place grew clearer the more he paid attention to what was not said outright. The writer had relied on familiarity, assuming that the words would be enough for them and perhaps for no one else. But the repetition of certain landmarks suggested a path rather than a destination. A route traveled more than once. A journey made deliberately, perhaps ritualistically. By late morning, he had narrowed it down to an area several miles outside town, beyond the last clusters of houses and into land that had long since been abandoned by development. Fields that once supported crops now lay fallow, overtaken by scrub and weeds. Old structures dotted the landscape there, remnants of uses that no longer justified their upkeep. It was a place people passed through without stopping, their attention fixed on destinations farther away. He drove out there with the photographs beside him on the passenger seat, glancing at them occasionally as the scenery shifted. The town fell away gradually, storefronts giving way to quieter roads, then to stretches of land where fences leaned inward as if tired of standing. The familiarity of the route unsettled him. He realized he had passed this way before without ever really seeing it, the way people often did with spaces that existed just beyond the edge of daily relevance. As he drove, the weight of his identity pressed more heavily on him than it had inside the house. Out here, away from the relative anonymity of the neighborhood, he felt exposed in a different way. A black man, alone on a rural road, following a trail hinted at in the writings of someone who had clearly lived with suspicion and hostility toward the world around them. The thought sharpened his awareness of risk. He reminded himself to remain cautious, to trust observation over assumption. He parked near the edge of a dirt road that narrowed into little more than a track. The photographs suggested that the remainder of the journey would need to be made on foot. He stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, listening. The air here felt different, less constrained. Wind moved freely through tall grass, carrying the dry scent of earth and decay. The sky stretched wide overhead, uninterrupted by power lines or rooftops. He followed the path indicated by the images, moving slowly, matching the angles and distances as best he could. With each step, details from the photographs aligned with reality. The bend in the road, the cluster of trees set back from the field, a shallow depression in the land that collected water after rain. The sense of recognition grew stronger with each confirmation, replacing uncertainty with a grim clarity. Eventually, he reached a stand of trees that matched the description in the diary with unsettling precision. One tree in particular stood out, its trunk bent at an unnatural angle near the base, as though it had once been damaged and grown around the wound rather than straightening. He stopped a short distance away, his body reacting before his mind fully caught up. There was nothing overtly threatening about the place, no markers, no signs. Yet the ground beneath the tree looked subtly different from its surroundings. He approached cautiously, scanning the area for signs of disturbance. The earth near the tree was uneven, its surface slightly sunken, as if something beneath it had shifted over time. Grass grew there, but thinner, less rooted. He knelt and pressed his hand against the ground. It was firm, but not compact in the way undisturbed soil usually was. There was give beneath the surface, a softness that spoke of disruption rather than erosion. The realization settled into him slowly, accompanied by a tightening in his chest. This was not merely a place mentioned in passing, it was an endpoint. He did not dig immediately. He stood and looked around again, taking in the wider landscape. An old, partially collapsed shed stood farther off, its roof caved in, its walls bleached by years of exposure. The structure matched one of the blurred shapes in the background of several photographs. Beyond it, the field stretched empty, the horizon broken only by distant trees. There were no houses nearby, no signs of recent activity. The former owner had chosen this place carefully. It was accessible, but overlooked. Close enough to town to reach without difficulty, far enough to remain unnoticed. A place where someone could come and go without drawing attention, where the land itself would absorb evidence over time. When he finally knelt again and began to clear the surface with his hands, he did so slowly, deliberately. He was aware of the gravity of the act, of the line he was crossing. Each movement felt measured, as though he were asking permission from the ground itself. Beneath the thin layer of grass and soil, he encountered a change in texture. The earth here had been turned, then settled, then reclaimed by time. He uncovered enough to confirm what he already knew. This was a grave, shallow, unmarked, deliberately concealed. Not the result of violence inflicted in haste, but of a choice carried out with grim resolve. The former owner had not fled. They had come here to end something, perhaps themselves, perhaps their role in whatever life they had been leading. He did not uncover more than necessary. The confirmation alone was enough. The diaries had not described escape. They had described preparation. The weapons had not been meant for a future confrontation. They had been contingencies, insurance against interference. When the time came, they had not been used. He sat back on his heels, breathing steadily, the enormity of the moment settling over him. The house, the photographs, the diaries, the weapons, all of it had led here. This place was the final chapter the former owner had written for themselves, trusting the land to keep their secret when the house no longer could. What struck him most was not fear, but a profound sense of intrusion mixed with responsibility. He had not sought this knowledge. He had not chosen to uncover a life and its end. Yet circumstance had placed him here, standing over a grave that history had nearly erased. As a black man, the implications pressed heavily on him. He could not ignore the possibility that the former owner's fear, their secrecy, their preparation, had been shaped by ideologies and actions that targeted people like him. The house, once merely old and worn, now appeared complicit by design. It had sheltered not just a person, but a mindset that thrived on concealment and control. He rose slowly and stepped back from the disturbed ground. He did not mark the spot. He did not photograph it. Some things, he sensed, required restraint even in exposure. He memorized the location instead, fixing it in his mind with the same clarity the former owner had once used to describe it. The drive back felt longer, heavier. The road seemed to stretch, each mile reinforcing the distance between what he had been before the discovery and what he was becoming now. The house came back into view eventually, its familiar shape unchanged, its roof line clean against the sky. From the outside, nothing suggested what he now knew. It stood quietly, as it always had, blending into the street with practiced invisibility. Yet he understood that the house was no longer just a dwelling. It was a node in a network of actions and intentions that extended beyond its walls. The burial site confirmed what the attic had hinted at. The former owner had orchestrated their disappearance deliberately, leaving behind not just possessions, but a trail meant to be followed. As he parked and stepped out of the car, the decision forming in him solidified further. The story could not end with private knowledge. The house had already given up its secrets. The land had confirmed them. What remained was to decide how much truth could be allowed to remain buried, and how much demanded to be brought into the open. The path he had followed away from the house had not led to closure. It had led to obligation. When he returned from the field beyond town, the house no longer received him the same way. Before, it had felt guarded, reserved, as though it were withholding something. Now it felt exposed, not open or welcoming, but laid bare, stripped of the careful silence it had maintained for decades. He stood in the front room longer than necessary, keys still in his hand, absorbing the subtle change in the air. The house was unchanged in any visible way, yet it no longer felt neutral. It felt implicated. The burial site had confirmed what the attic had only suggested. The former owner had not disappeared by accident, nor had they fled under pressure. They had planned their own erasure with the same precision that had shaped the hidden cavity in the roof. The house had not been abandoned in haste. It had been left behind deliberately, prepared to outlast its owner and to safeguard the remnants of a life that could not continue openly. He moved through the room slowly, replaying the chain of discoveries in his mind. The uneven roof, the seam beneath the shingles, the boxes arranged with care, photographs that documented presence rather than memory, diaries written not for reflection but for control, weapons preserved not as relics but as tools, and finally the grave, unmarked and intentional. Each element reinforced the same conclusion. This house had not been an ordinary home. It had been a structure adapted for secrecy. The implications of that realization pressed down on him steadily. The former owner had lived here for years, perhaps decades, moving through these same rooms with an entirely different purpose. The walls had witnessed planning, waiting, preparation. The attic had not been a forgotten space, but an active one, accessed, modified, used. The roof itself had been altered to conceal, to protect, to endure. Nothing about it had been accidental. He found himself standing again beneath the attic hatch, looking up at the plain panel in the ceiling. It seemed smaller now, more deliberate. The space above it felt closer, heavier, as though the knowledge he carried had shortened the distance between floors. He understood now why the attic had unsettled him from the beginning. It was not intuition or imagination. It was recognition without context. The house had always carried tension because it had been designed to hold it. As a black man living alone in this town, the meaning of that history cut sharply. The former owner's fear, vigilance, and preparation were not abstract traits. They were shaped by ideology, by beliefs that required secrecy because they thrived on control and exclusion. The weapons, the documentation, the careful concealment all pointed toward a life lived in opposition to others, toward an identity built around threat and anticipation. And the house had served as shelter for that identity. He considered what silence would mean now. He could repair the roof properly, seal the cavity, return the boxes to their hidden place, or destroy them quietly. The grave lay far enough from town that it might never be discovered. The house would remain just another aging structure on a tired street. His life might settle back into a fragile normal, but the thought felt false. Silence was not neutrality. It was participation by omission. The house had already broken its own silence by revealing the seam beneath the roof. Water had forced what time alone had preserved. To ignore that revelation would be to accept the role of caretaker for a secret that was not his and should never have been protected. The responsibility, he felt, was not imposed by law or expectation. It arose from proximity, from the simple fact that he lived here now, beneath a roof that had been used to hide more than weather. He sat at the kitchen table and laid out the photographs, diaries, and notes he had taken from memory of the burial site. Seeing them together clarified the pattern further. The former owner had not merely been an individual acting in isolation. The diaries referenced others indirectly. The photographs hinted at gatherings, at figures deliberately kept at the edge of the frame. The care taken to preserve records suggested that these materials had value beyond personal reassurance. They were evidence of participation in something larger. That realization shifted the weight of the discovery from personal unease to public consequence. This was no longer just a strange history attached to a property. It was a fragment of a broader past that had been intentionally buried. The house had functioned as a node, a quiet storage point within a network that depended on invisibility. The fact that the network had dissolved did not erase its impact. Its remnants still existed, waiting to be acknowledged. He thought of the town itself, of the way neighbors watched from behind curtains, of the polite distance maintained since he moved in, of the absence of curiosity about the house's past. In places like this, history often survived not through documentation, but through omission. Certain stories were allowed to fade, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. The former owner had counted on that kind of forgetting. The decision he faced was no longer abstract. He could not pretend that exposing this history would leave him untouched. Bringing the truth into the open would alter how the house was seen, how the street was perceived, how he himself would be regarded. He would become associated with the discovery whether he wanted that role or not. There would be scrutiny, questions, perhaps resentment. The town would have to confront a version of itself that it had long avoided. He felt fear then, sharp and specific, not of the past itself, but of the present response to its exposure. As someone who already existed at the margins of the town's unspoken comfort, he understood how easily narratives could be twisted, how quickly the discoverer of an uncomfortable truth could be recast as its cause. The idea that he might be accused of exaggeration, or worse, fabrication, flickered through his mind and refused to disappear. Yet the alternative felt worse. To live beneath this roof knowing what it had concealed, to walk these rooms aware of their role in preserving a hidden ideology, and to do nothing would mean accepting a form of complicity. The house would remain stable, but his sense of ownership would rot from within. He would not be living in a home. He would be maintaining a lie. The realization settled with a kind of weary clarity. He had not chosen this responsibility, but it had chosen him. The storm had forced him onto the roof. The seam had forced his attention. The boxes had forced understanding. And the burial site had removed any remaining ambiguity. The story demanded conclusion, not concealment. He began to prepare carefully. He documented everything he could without disturbing the materials further. Photographs of the boxes as they had been found in the attic. Notes detailing the sequence of discovery. A written account of the burial site, described precisely but without embellishment. He understood the importance of accuracy now. Emotion would not protect him. Clarity might. As night fell, the house seemed to contract around him. The familiar sounds returned, but they no longer carried mystery. They were simply the responses of an old structure adjusting to temperature and time. The attic above him felt empty now, not because the boxes were gone, but because their meaning had been stripped of secrecy. The house no longer held power over him through ignorance. He stood at the front window and looked out at the street. Lights glowed softly behind curtains. Cars passed occasionally, their movement slow and unremarkable. Nothing in the neighborhood suggested awareness of what had just been uncovered. Yet he knew that would not last once he acted. The quiet was temporary, a pause before consequence. The decision finalized itself without drama. He would not attempt to interpret or manage this alone. The materials belonged to history now, not to him. Their exposure required structure, accountability, and distance from personal control. Whatever came next would be difficult, but difficulty was preferable to silence. He stepped away from the window and picked up his phone. The house felt strangely still, as though it were waiting. For decades, it had served as a container for secrecy. Now, it stood on the threshold of becoming something else entirely. The truth about its past, once buried above the ceiling and beneath the earth, was ready to surface. And with that, truth would come a reckoning, not just for the house, but for the community that had lived alongside it without ever asking what it concealed. The house had given up its history. What remained was the choice of what to do with it. He did not make the call immediately. After setting the phone down on the table, he stood in the center of the living room and let the silence settle. The house felt emptied out in a way that was difficult to describe. Not hollow, not abandoned, but relieved, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. The knowledge he carried no longer pressed upward from the ceiling or outward from the walls. It sat with him now, fully formed, no longer hidden, and because of that, it demanded action rather than fear. When he finally picked up the phone, his hand was steadier than he expected. Fear was still there, but it had sharpened into focus instead of chaos. He explained calmly what he had found, how the discovery had begun with roof repairs, how a concealed cavity had revealed boxes containing photographs, written records, and weapons, and how those materials pointed toward a burial site outside town. He did not speculate or dramatize. He stated facts in the order they had unfolded. The restraint in his voice surprised even him. Saying the words aloud did not make the story feel unreal. It anchored it. The response was methodical. Instructions were given. He was told not to disturb the items further and to remain available. When the call ended, he sat back and waited. The minutes that followed felt elongated, each sound in the house magnified by anticipation. He became acutely aware of his own presence within the space, of the way his footsteps sounded on the floorboards, of how the walls absorbed and returned sound. This was the last period of quiet the house would know for some time. When the authorities arrived, the shift was immediate. The boundary between private space and public consequence dissolved the moment the door opened. The house that had belonged solely to him hours earlier now became a site of interest, its rooms assessed with professional detachment. He led them to the attic, watched as they examined the hatch, the beams, the altered sections of the roof structure. Their reactions were controlled, but unmistakable. The care taken to document every detail confirmed what he already knew. This was not being treated as an oddity. It was being treated as evidence. As the boxes were removed from the attic, one by one, the space seemed to lighten physically. Dust rose and settled again, disturbed for the first time in decades. The attic was no longer a repository. It was just a room beneath the roof. Watching the items leave was unexpectedly emotional, not because he felt attached to them, but because their removal marked a transition. The house was being stripped of a role it had played silently for years. The burial site was investigated shortly after. Specialists confirmed what he had already understood. The grave was deliberate, concealed, and old. The remains were consistent with the timeline suggested by the diaries. The story began to solidify into something that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or paranoia. What had been hidden was now verified. News spread quickly, faster than he anticipated. In a town that had learned to survive through selective memory, the revelation was destabilizing. Conversations shifted. Faces changed when they saw him. Some neighbors avoided the house entirely, crossing the street rather than passing by. Others lingered at a distance, curiosity and discomfort mingling in their expressions. The house, once invisible, had become a focal point. Investigations expanded beyond the property. The materials from the attic connected to names and locations buried in old records. Patterns emerged that linked the former owner to activities long dismissed or forgotten. The house was no longer an isolated anomaly. It was a fragment of a broader history that had been intentionally obscured. Through it all, he remained where he was. He did not leave town. He did not sell the house or distance himself from it. The suggestion was made more than once, quietly, as though remaining might be seen as provocative or unwise. But he stayed. Leaving would have felt like retreat, and retreat would have handed the narrative back to silence. When the investigations concluded and the house was returned fully to him, the space felt altered again. Not lighter this time, but clearer. The attic was empty. The roof had been repaired properly, the concealed cavity dismantled and sealed. What had once been a deliberate hiding place no longer existed. The structure was honest now, incapable of holding secrets in the same way. He spent time alone in the attic afterward, not searching, but reclaiming. He cleaned the dust that had accumulated over years, reinforced the floor where it had once supported hidden weight, erased faint markings left on beams by hands long gone. Each small act felt intentional, a quiet rewriting of purpose. The attic became what it had never truly been before, just a part of the house. The town adjusted slowly. Some resisted, some denied. Others, after initial discomfort, began to acknowledge what had been uncovered. History, once abstract, now had physical proof. The past could no longer be spoken about only in careful generalities. It had names, places, and consequences. That shift was uncomfortable, but it was real. For him, the greatest change was internal. The house no longer represented compromise alone. It had become a place of confrontation, of responsibility. He had not sought to become a witness to history, but circumstance had placed him there. By choosing exposure over concealment, he had altered not just the story of the house, but his relationship to it. There were nights when the weight of it all returned, when the memory of the attic and the field beyond town pressed into his thoughts. But those moments passed more quickly now. They no longer carried uncertainty. The truth, once exposed, had lost its power to haunt. It could be remembered without being feared. Standing in the yard one evening, he looked up at the repaired roof. The shingles lay flat and uniform, giving no hint of what had once been hidden beneath them. That absence felt appropriate. The purpose of uncovering the past was not to leave scars visible forever, but to ensure that what caused them could not return unseen. He went back inside and closed the door behind him. The sound was familiar, grounding. The house settled around him not as a keeper of secrets, but as a place reclaimed through understanding. It was still old, still imperfect, still required work and attention, but it no longer belonged to silence. The story that had begun with a simple repair had ended in exposure, not because he sought it, but because he refused to look away. The house stood now as it always had, on the same street, among the same neighbors. Yet its meaning had changed. It was no longer a vessel for hidden intent. It was simply a house again, shaped by choice rather than fear. And in that quiet transformation, he found something he had not expected when he first bought it. Not pride, not triumph, but belonging. If this story kept you watching until the end, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, more hidden discoveries, buried truths, and stories that change everything in a single moment. Watch the other videos on the channel. Some of them reveal secrets no one expected to be found. And if this story surprised you or made you think, share it with others. The truth matters more when it's seen by more people.